Okay, hello everyone. My name is Chris Reagan. I'm the director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University, and welcome to the next installment of our webinar series on policy challenges during a pandemic. Today, who we have is John Stewart. John Stewart is the Director of Policy and Research at the Canadian Nuclear Association. He also taught a case study this past year in the MPP program at the Max Bell School. And today he's going to talk about the world oil market, COVID-19, and international politics, and how all of those things come together in fascinating ways. So without further ado, let me turn it over to John Stewart. John, take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. And thank you all for joining me. You know, there are certain big things happening right now that are sort of triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic and sort of happening anyway. A global recession might or might not have been arriving anyway. It looks like one was, and COVID has simply tipped us into it. And some sort of financial and property crisis in China was probably happening anyway, and COVID has made that accelerate. And finally, there was going to be a falling out on what to do about oil production between the Saudis and the Russians. And that got accelerated by the sudden drop in oil demand in China, which has become a sudden drop in global oil demand. Does it matter whether these things were going to happen anyway or not? Maybe not, but if they were sort of independent and happening anyway, it further discredits the idea that when the pandemic is over, we're going to sort of return back to the world as it was in a few months as soon as the lockdown ends. That's not as believable if these things were happening anyhow. The couple of core messages that I want to convey here are that oil matters, that oil drives certain kinds of power relationships around the world, and that even inside a country, those power relationships exist, for example, between Alberta and Ottawa here in Canada, and that those power relations are being sharply disrupted by COVID's impact on oil demand. So oil still matters, and it's affecting revenue in particular for a lot of states and sub-state governments, and their ability to act is being affected by this. And that has huge consequences. The rapid filling of oil storage capacity is going to force imminent production shutdowns. We're running out of slack. So all of those things are going to really matter in the month of April and months to come. I want to give credit to a couple of my favorite authorities on this subject. When I was a student of economics in the 1980s, I had the honor of being taught by a guy named Peter Odell, who's teaches in the Netherlands. He's British, but he wrote Oil and World Power, which ran to many editions in the 70s and 80s, and was a terrific source at the time. And Daniel Yergin, an American, who wrote a book called The Prize and has continued to comment very informatively on the subject of oil, the world oil market, and the power relationships behind it. So two great reads. I am sure some people have chosen not to attend this webinar out of a belief that oil is history and that we are in the process of ending our reliance on it, and so there can be little benefit in bothering to learn about it because it's all going to be ancient history. That notion has been around since I was a young teenager in the 1970s, and I have believed it from time to time, and I do hope for the end of fossil fuels. But I have found great benefit in learning about the oil market. It has informed a lot of what I've learned about the state of the world generally. And so I hope you'll agree with me after this, and if not after listening to me, then maybe after reading people like Peter and David, or Daniel, sorry. The use of oil and fossil fuels has not been declining. We are continuing to use more of it each year. This year is going to be a very rare exception. Despite nearly 50 years of policy effort to reduce our use of fossil fuels, we keep using more oil, coal, and natural gas. So 50 years of policy effort has not turned that around. What do we use it for? Well, mostly for transportation, not just driving motor vehicles around, but flying planes around and pushing marine vessels around, which is incredibly energy intensive to push a hull through the water. takes a lot of power. We use it for industrial fuel, you know, everything from cooking wood pulp to, you know, you name it. It's a feedstock for petrochemical and plastics industries, and we use it to heat buildings. So that's what we use oil for. It's an incredibly unusual development that world oil consumption has fallen in the past couple of months by over 15%. That is extremely rare and very remarkable. Now, this graph just basically illustrates that point. Notice that the long-term curve since 1990 and going up, these are US government projections, show continued use of oil rising, natural gas also rising. What is happening is that coal is flattening off. We have been leveling off the world's use of coal, and that's good news, not just for greenhouse gas, but also for local air quality. People's respiratory health and life expectancies and so on will benefit if we can get that coal curve to move downward. Renewables have been growing, but they are not displacing fossil fuels. Renewables more or less grow in tandem with gas in many jurisdictions, such as Canada and the US, because renewables are too intermittent to be a reliable source of power on their own, so they need gas to back them up. Nuclear is there. It makes a big contribution to cleaner air, but it is not growing the way it needs to. And so we're going to remain an oil-dependent world unless something really radical changes. The next graph is different data. This is International Energy Agency, but it's more or less showing you the same thing. In their standard sort of current policy scenario, consumption of fossil fuels keeps going up, except for coal. If you add together the 2040 numbers for all the cleaner sources of energy, the 5 columns on the right, you still only get clean energy about equal to oil alone, never mind natural gas and coal, by the year 2040. So 20 years from now, we're still using as much oil as all the cleaner energy sources put together, all the non-fossil fuels put together. So that's, you know, if you, it may be plausible to replace internal combustion engines, internal combustion vehicles with electricity. That's something we might be able to do in the next 20 years, but there is currently not any plausible plan to displace fossil fuels from marine vessels, for example. We have an available technology to do that, which is small reactors, which can push vessels around pretty well. But there's no plan to actually replace fossil fuels in marine transport. So there's an inexorable degradation of the marine environment there. And there is not even an available technology to replace jet aircraft transport. There is really no way that we are going to, no believable way that we're going to replace the use of fossil fuels to drive airplanes in the next 20 years. So we're going to keep using oil. When I was young, meaning in the early 1970s, it was widely believed that we would run out of oil, but that has not been happening. Oil, gas, and coal continue to be extremely abundant. The technology for finding it and extracting it keep getting better. Our ability to use it efficiently keeps improving, for example, through vehicle standards. So paradoxically, some of the policies we've had to mitigate our dependence on fossil fuel, such as legislating better vehicle emissions, or better vehicle efficiency standards, have simply made it more economical to use fossil fuel driven technologies. And this makes the competition very, very tough for clean technologies. It's very, very hard to promote a new clean technology in the face of these very, very efficient incumbent oil-driven technologies. So we were not fundamentally changing global reliance on fossil fuels at the start of this year. That was not turning around, despite many policy measures to attempt to do that. If you want fossil fuel consumption reduced, as I do, then the best friend you've had lately is COVID-19, which has reduced oil consumption by about 15%. Your next best friend is the fact that China is building nuclear power plants rather than coal plants, which is improving global emissions. And then your third best friend is the increasing affordability and accessibility of wind and solar, which are helping quite a lot, but are have to be part of a wider clean energy strategy. Where is all this oil coming from? How come we have so much of it? Well, this roughly tells you where it comes from. The size of the country map is proportionate to the reserves. That's not the geological availability, but rather the reserves that have been found and proven in those countries. Um, there's a lot of oil, particularly in the Middle East, a good deal in Russia, and some in the Western Hemisphere, Canada, US, and Venezuela. But it's more expensive in some of these places than in others. There are various kinds of deposits. Some of it is just oily dirt. Some of it is liquid oil, but it's under an ocean or in the Arctic somewhere. The places where it's really affordable to get to are in the Middle East: Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and then to a lesser extent in Russia. And the oil in other places is there, and it's locally useful, but it's much, much smaller. The Persian Gulf region is by far the most accessible. Since the 1930s, this has been the source of much of the world's oil. And this is what drove the interest of the US, the UK, and Europe in being involved in Middle Eastern affairs. The increasing reliance of the Western countries on that very affordable Middle Eastern oil has been a lot of the more recent motive for those countries, the Western countries, to get involved in geopolitics in the Near East. Before that, there were other things. The British needed access to Suez so they could get to India. The Americans had various kinds of interests in the Middle East. And freedom of navigation was a major motivator. They wanted to be involved there because they wanted the navigation free. Now it's kind of turned around. They need freedom of navigation to protect the transport of key commodities such as oil. There are high and low cost producers. Look at the numbers on this table, the marginal production cost column, and look way down to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's production cost is about $3 a barrel, okay, for onshore oil. Look up halfway to Venezuela, it's about $20 a barrel. Look a little farther up to Canada. Canada's oil sands are $90 a barrel. The United States is somewhere in between. Shale oil in the US, because US and Canada have been running out of conventional oil reserves, so they're extracting it from oil sands and oil shale. They're in the 70 to 90 range. And then Russia is cheap onshore at $18, but very expensive in the Arctic. So that gives you an idea. It matters a lot how high your production costs are. There are a few big players. The oil suppliers that are also geopolitical players are small in number. There's Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the USA. They're the big suppliers to the world oil market that also have geopolitical reach. The big importers are the USA, which also imports because it's a huge consumer. China is very dependent on imports, so is Japan, India to some extent, and the EU. So those are the ones that really care about stability and reliability of access. Canada's a little unusual. We are a great big oil producer, but we don't play directly in the market because we can only export it to the United States. That's where our pipelines run to. And it has to go into the US refining system and then be exported as refined fuel or as or through US ports. So we really only have one immediate customer, which is the USA. This just makes the point that there are a few big players, and note that the North American countries, the lower two jiggly lines on this graph, Canada and the US, they've both been increasing their production lately. That's largely a reflection of improved technology of extraction, and they've been exporting it into the world market. We've been growing our production more than we've been using the stuff. That oil has to transport through about 6 key choke points in the world. There are transportation bottlenecks this stuff has to go through: the Bosporus, Gibraltar, Suez Canal, Straits of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Straits of Malacca. So the interest in freedom of navigation is very, very important here. To have free and safe navigation, you don't have pirates hijacking the oil tankers, that kind of thing. Very important. And to the extent that you're dependent on oil imports, you're probably also dependent on freedom of navigation to make sure that that oil can get to you. So things vary a lot in the oil market. It's always been a highly variable industry. in my lifetime, just since I started reading the newspapers, I've seen the Arab oil embargo, which produced a tremendous jump in prices in 1973, a second jump at the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and associated events. There have been various attempts by the producing countries in the Gulf region to manage the supply and keep prices at a level that they and their stakeholders could accept. And the Saudi success in managing that has been mixed. There was a commodity price bubble about 10 to 15 years ago that drove prices of all commodities up. And lately there have been great improvements in technology of extraction, mostly driven out of North America. We've had great innovations in oil sands efficiency of extraction and great innovations in fracturing shale deposits. So you sort of explode the underground and break up the rock formation, and then a whole bunch of oil comes out that you couldn't reach before. And now we've had COVID. So here's what the curve has looked like. This is a logarithmic scale, excuse me. And as you can see, it's a market that since about 1970 has been very highly variable. So what's happened in the past couple of months? Well, Chinese demand collapsed in January to February due to the epidemic in China. That was the first step. And as a result of that, a tenuous entente between the Saudis and the Russians, which was known as OPEC Plus, or was sometimes known as the Vienna Accord, that broke up. The Saudis and Russians could no longer agree on how to manage the market. And the Saudis announced the intention to increase their production. And just as they did that, global demand worldwide began to collapse as air traffic shut down and other forms of transport began to drop. And you had a simultaneous announcement by the Saudis that they were going to produce all they wanted, along with this global collapse in demand. And as a result, there was a dramatic plunge in the oil price, about 50 to 70%. And what's happened is that you can't shut down production easily. So high-cost producers can't turn off the taps without a few weeks of preparation, and it costs them money to do it. A lot of the wells have pressure coming from underground. I'm not a petroleum engineer, but it's not easy to shut off an oil well unexpectedly. And so storage fills up very rapidly. All the tank farms fill up. All the tankers at sea get filled whenever they come to port. Anybody who has the capacity to store it at these low prices and wants to speculate in the market will do it. You fill up all the pipelines, and after a while you run out of storage space. And what's going to happen is that within a few weeks you'll have virtually every possible option for storing the stuff will be used, and you'll have very costly shutdowns in the industry, particularly among the highest cost producers. A lot of unemployment in regions of countries where this stuff is produced, and gigantic losses of fiscal revenue. Now, different governments are dependent on oil to different degrees. The metaphor of addiction, being addicted to cheap oil or being addicted to oil revenues, is not misplaced. It's not too dramatic to describe what happens to countries that have oil reserves. Look at a place like Algeria, which is absolutely dependent on $100 oil. They're now getting like $7 or $10 oil, but they're dependent on $100 oil to break even in their fiscal policy. In other words, for their national budget to break even, they need $109 oil, according to this graph. That's a pretty difficult situation, and countries just get dependent on that. Iran's situation, of course, is a little bit special because of US sanctions. Their economic constraints are extremely difficult. But you look down the chart, there's a lot of countries there that need oil to be a lot more expensive than it is right now, and who are going to have very big economic problems, very big fiscal problems, and very big external balance problems if oil stays at $10 or less. So I am not an expert in world affairs, although I do try to talk to people who are. And here's some things that strike me as an amateur armchair observer of geopolitics as things to watch. The pandemic revealed just how hard US sanctions have been for ordinary Iranians. The idea that US sanctions are aimed at the regime and not at the people is pretty ringing a bit hollow, I think, on the streets Iran these days. The oil collapse has deepened the challenge the government faces in helping its people. They've done their best, but a lot of misery has been imposed, and it's pretty clear that sanctions have been very, very harmful for ordinary Iranians. It's interesting to speculate about what that might mean for the future of the regime versus the USA, particularly as US influence has been retreating from that part of the world. In Russia, oil revenue really sustains Vladimir Putin's regime and has helped him maintain his popularity, buy friends, push back against the West by running military operations in Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, pushing back against the expansion of NATO or the proposed expansion of NATO. And it's allowed him to buy friends around the world, to subsidize arms shipments, to subsidize civilian nuclear energy technology. He will be really hobbled by the oil price collapse if it lasts a long time. So that'll be very interesting to watch. China has been lending very generously to commodity producing developing countries in Asia and Africa, and I think South America to some extent, and they are not going to be able to pay back. COVID plus the oil collapse is destroying their ability to make good on a lot of those investments. So does that feed back into a Chinese financial crisis? I have no idea, but it's certainly an interesting question. The US influence in the past 15 years has been retreating from the Middle East as a consequence of a string of policy failures. Their dependence on Gulf oil has declined. Their interest in selling oil internationally has been growing. So they're more interested in a higher oil price than they used to be. They've dumped their deal with Iran. Their crucial relationship with the Saudis has deteriorated. It is not absurd to think that the US's main interest in Middle East diplomacy now will mainly be around stabilizing the price of oil, rather than trying to fix all other problems and change regimes and so on. So as a lifelong student of US foreign policy, I'll be very, very curious to see how the US behaves among its, with its Middle Eastern partners, especially the Saudis. What about Canada? I'm nearly done here. Alberta and Ottawa have had a long struggle over oil infrastructure and a long struggle for power, really, regional power, which was hitched to a large extent to Alberta's prosperity, which was hitched to oil. Pipelines for export was Alberta's overwhelming concern. It didn't matter what the question was, the answer was they needed a pipeline for the past 10 years. And that's now swamped by a completely different problem. Their high-cost oil sands facilities are going to have to shut down very quickly. There's going to be job losses. Huge drop in regional GDP has already happened. Alberta is enormously weakened. Huge loss of revenue for both levels of government. And dealing with the West and recovering its political support in the West was already a very high priority for Justin Trudeau's federal government. So we're going to see a whole new level of difficulty in those relationships. And meanwhile, Canada and the US are both going to be pressured to participate in some kind of production control arrangement. One was announced yesterday, but it wasn't enough to solve the problem these countries are facing. The challenge is that while Saudi Arabia and Russia can more or less impose political decisions on their oil sectors, the US and Canada can't do that. So it's very hard for the US and Canada, even if they want to participate in production cuts to support prices. So that'll be interesting to watch. I'm sorry I'm not offering answers to these, but I don't think that's wise. The questions are more interesting than the answers in my view. So the last thing I want to comment on as someone who works in the clean energy field is that this drop in the price of oil, particularly if it's sustained for a while, really changes the climate policy game. Fossil fuels have always been tremendously cheap, and it's been very, very difficult to promote clean energy in the face of the sophisticated incumbent technologies for fossil fuels. The very efficient vehicles are hard to beat with a new wave of electric vehicle technologies, let alone, finding efficient ways to heat houses and so on. So the barriers to decarbonizing the energy system just got higher. But on the other hand, we've had a sudden drop in greenhouse gas emissions. That's good. Maybe we can build some of those in and sustain them. Maybe the habit of flying everywhere at the drop of a hat can be reduced somehow. Maybe we can have a permanent move toward less driving around. Business habits have certainly changed in my world. And finally, there's going to be huge infrastructure spending as part of the stimulus to move us out of this, into the rebound phase of the pandemic response. And in that infrastructure spending, there is no doubt an opportunity to accelerate our shift to a cleaner economy. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there.